aged at all, even after so many. So
Special
Tony,
effects here.
so Tony will kick off the reading. Let me formally introduce Tony. I'll read the bio he sent me, and it's also on the chat screen on the side, so you can read that. Tony April's novel Persistence of Memory was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, nominated for the Impact Dublin Prize and the Sunday Times Literary Prize, South Africa, and the winner of the Koret International Jewish Book Prize for Fiction. His short story collection, Temporary Sojourner, which I have in my house actually, which you signed way back at Breadloaf,
Mhm.
was also NYT Notable Book, and his stories have appeared in Plowshares, Agni, Story Quarterly, Glimmer Train, Post Road, and elsewhere. His essays and book reviews have appeared in The Nation, The New York Times, Washington Post, Details, George, and elsewhere. He grew up in South Africa, where his father was the editor of the first mass circulation multiracial newspaper, the Golden City Post. Tony has taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, Northwestern University, Bennington College, Williams College, Skidmore, and around the world, including in Syria and Israel. He is currently on the fiction faculty of Lesley University's low residency MFA program in creative writing. Tony, a great, great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining.
Great. Thank you, Sudeep. So it's really a pleasure to be part of the series again, going back to, was it 1989, I think, was when we had the original reading series. I'm actually joining you, I usually live in Vermont, and I'm joining you from San Diego. So my first time on a plane in about a year and a half was last night, which is also why I'm a little discombobulated from travel. I'm going to read from, I've been working on a novel for, well, literally forever, called The War Artist. And it's based on actually a fact surprisingly few people know, but that during World War II, there were a large number of painters and artists who actually were employed by various Allied armies to um, paint the battles, the war, what was going on the home front. And the idea was that artists were better able to convey the feel and the meaning of war than photographers, for example. And one of the people who started this program was Sir Kenneth Clark, who also wanted to save the generation of artists because so many had been lost in World War I. So I have two characters, two protagonists in this novel, a man who becomes a war artist and a woman who they have an on again, off again love affair, who's a swimmer, a German Jewish woman. And I'm just going to read the opening prologue of the novel, and I'm reading off the screen. I'm sorry, I usually like to read from print, but everything's been a little topsy-turvy. But I'm going to go ahead and read. So here we go. How easy it is to unravel a life. This phrase has been running through Henry's brain all day, entering on the back of thoughts and images of Elsa, whom he will see later tonight. Having been near 3 different fronts in the war, Henry knows the truth of the statement in his bones, though he did not realize it applies so readily to love too. He thinks of that little Cockney bantam with a quizzical smirk, a face ironed into his mind, though he has trouble accessing the fellow's name. Something ordinary, Frankie Riggs, was it, or Diggs? 19 years old and 5'2" at the most, Frankie had biceps that rolled around like cricket balls beneath the skin of his upper arms. They were in Tunisia, a few miles from the fighting that shifted back and forth as unpredictably as the desert sands. Their quarters, which they had to stay in for much of the day, consisted of ready-made wooden huts built of wooden beams hastily nailed together, a canvas roof, beds and mattresses thrown higgledy-piggledy together. Frankie would regularly leap off the table to grab the rafters of their makeshift sleeping quarters and move from beam to beam as agilely as any monkey. It was a trick he loved to perform, a welcome distraction to the not so distant crack of PAK 38s and the thunderous boom provided by Big Bertha. Riggs liked to talk about how he would go into the forest not far from his little backwater English town and swing from tree to tree like a bloomin' gibbon. Frankie had always wanted to be a circus aerialist and had trained himself assiduously from his childhood on. He was fascinated and deeply amused by anything to do with women's lingerie, knickers, he called it. It was perhaps as close to a woman's skin as Frankie's imagination dared to go. On the last occasion that Henry had seen the boy, Frankie had just finished recounting an involved humorous tale about a girl with a man's name, Nicholas. Nicholas, get it? He insisted, only half suspecting that the other men's cheerful laughter was as much at his innocence as at his joke telling. And still bubbling with humor, he had picked up a copy of the Daily Serviceman, one with a cartoon by Henry himself that made fun of Rommel's affection for his ridiculous little dog, and headed out into the heat of the North African sun toward the trench latrines. Just minutes later, Big Bertha boomed again, but this time the whistle of the mortar shell sounded awfully close and all the men ducked their heads before there was the thump of impact nearby and the ground shook, books and bags fell off bunks and toothbrushes rattled in their cups. Henry and Sergeant Adderley were first to the door, greeted by dust overladen with the smell of cordite, ozone, and shit. They ran toward the latrines still hidden in the settling dust and almost stumbled over a crawling figure covered in blood and fecal matter, Frankie desperately trying to escape the horror behind him, his trousers gone, Nicholas, his right leg gone too, from the thigh down, his mouth open with shock. Had he not died of blood loss a minute or two later, the latrine bacteria in his wounds would surely have done for him, though Henry and Sergeant Adderley vainly tried to wash away the excrement with a sergeant's water bottle. 2 days later, the Allies overran the German forces, their supply lines having thinned out, as Hitler turned his attention to the invasion of Greece and left Rommel without the support he'd been promised. The deep-voiced railgun, a 170 millimeter that was one of innumerable artillery pieces Henry would hear nicknamed Big Bertha during his journeys to the fields of battle, had been spiked and blown so it could not be used against its former masters. Henry's watercolor, The Gun, titled She's Silent Now, is on display at the War Museum near the Johannesburg Zoo. He has never liked the muddy ochre wash with which he caught the big gun's shape and shadow, though there's something in the stark outline that captures the eye. He has tried once or twice to put Frankie's sidelong smile on paper or canvas, but somehow he has never been able to capture that particular flash of light, of life. He is not sure now if he really wanted to. He has seen lives undone by violence in peacetime too. His friend Tom Regnall, a brilliant journalist in the phrase applied to him by all who knew him, had gone outside the Daily Express late one Saturday night to have a smoke and think about the editorial he has almost finished revising, and had been hit on the back of the head with an iron pipe for the money in his pants pocket. The blow had done something to his brain and he had stumbled around to the front gate, unable to pronounce words properly, had not been recognized by the substitute night watchman who shooed away the drunk. Plenty of inebriated white tramps wandering downtown Johannesburg of a Saturday night, and who wanted them urinating against the walls of the newspaper office? Staggering from building to building, Regnall had wandered near the Market Theatre, jeered at and abused by late night revelers, until journalists driving by recognized something about this pitiful, shambling figure on the street. He had never fully recovered, was living poorly on a small pension, unable to work except at the simplest of jobs. That violence isn't the only thing that can undo a life, Henry is now discovering. There is the subtle damage you do to yourself and nonetheless devastating for that. The last of the great romantics, Henry mutters ruefully to himself, comparing the bolt of new, or rather refound love that had struck him just a week ago to a mortar shell hitting an occupied latrine. He tries to shake off these morbid thoughts as he locks up his car, pockets the keys, and walks toward the restaurant where he is to meet Elsa. Inside the Trattoria del Gallo, Elsa sits alone at a table for two in the corner, a candle guttering in a jar on the table, a glass of Trebbiano d'Abruzzo in front of her. When Henry walks in, he makes note of the tableau that she has created, as formally configured as that of any Renaissance painter. The way the candle softens her cheeks but deepens the hollow of her eyes, the sparkle at the edge of her glass of white wine, the hanging folds of tablecloth splashed with maroon in the light from the red glass jar. Her face is brooding, contemplative, but the smile that widens her full lips as she catches sight of him, dimples appearing on her cheeks, is of genuine pleasure. To Henry, it appears as if the darkened, tawdry restaurant has suddenly been bathed in light. "Did you think I wasn't going to show up?" he asks, dropping onto the chair opposite hers, his knees pushing against the cloth and almost causing her wine to spill. "If I were thinking," she replies, "I probably would not be here." He says nothing, but sits quietly, looking at her face, the hazel-flecked irises of her frank gaze, the way her artificially thinned eyebrows dart inwards as she blushes and looks down at her wineglass. "I'm never not thinking, that's half my trouble." He smiles, softening the words. "And now, you're the other half." "I was wondering how long it would take you to start picking on me," Elsa retorts, but there is a faint grin playing around the edges of her mouth, and he knows it's going to be all right. "I hope you don't take your annoyance out on some poor monkey later on." They were both quiet then, letting the memory of their meeting 2 decades ago before settling upon them, ridiculous, comic in retrospect, rife with misunderstandings. And here they are, she married to his former best friend, the one who had initially prejudiced him against her. He also settled into an uneventful marriage with 2 vulnerable young boys at home. And so it begins, the unraveling. Okay, thank you. That's the opening.
Yeah.
What is the title of the novel?
The title is The War Artist.
And when does it come out? Who brings it out?
I'm still writing it, finishing off.
Okay.
So yeah, asking me a tough question.
No. I thought you were reading from a proof for galley.
No, I'm reading from work in progress.
It's really very gripping and engaging.
Oh, thank you.
So this beautiful line which struck me, there's a subtle damage you do to yourself.
Yeah.
You know, and it's so resonant in a sense, you know, in days we're living in, that not only damage is happening from elsewhere, but that sort of also makes us internally damage ourselves, even if we don't want to. Yeah, thank you very, very much. And on that note, actually, I wanted to do this before we started, but maybe to a count of 10, we can just have a secular prayer for all the people who are dying and burning in the streets of Delhi and in Colombia, who are being shot at in the helicopters, as Imran says. So just 10 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tony, that was
Yeah.
marvelous.
Marvelous, yeah.
Really, really good.
I too, I'd written that line down in the chat about the subtle damage. And I think the way you finish that chapter just really grips you to move you on and want to read more. And so it begins the unraveling.
Yes.
Who is not fascinated by the unraveling, you know, or will not be fascinated? Very good,
Yeah.
very good. Thank you.
Beautiful. No, you know, when poets pick out lines from fiction writers, I don't say the poets are better than fiction writers by any means, but you know, there's something really, really working in prose. You know, if these phrases and lines leap out, because it's not that common, you know, especially when we read fiction, which is why the sorts of fiction writers, not that I wouldn't read others, but the sorts of fiction writers I go back to are sort of, say, people like Pico Iyer or say Brodsky's essays. He's a poet who can write beautiful prose, for instance. On that note, let me welcome a poet from where? Guyana, though she's become very English. The commonalities we have, food and poetry. And that's why she famously ran or runs the Malaika Kitchen, which is basically a poetry surgery and thrown in with a lot of food thrown in, I believe. But let me formally introduce Malaika. I'll put the bio up as well. Malaika Booker is a poetry lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, a British poet of Guyanese and Grenadinian parentage, and the founder of the Malaika Poetry Kitchen. A pamphlet, Breadfruit, received the Poetry Society recommendation, and a poetry collection, Pepper Seed, from People Tree Press, was shortlisted for the OCM Bookass Prize and the Seamus Heaney Center 2014 prize for the first full collection. She is published with the poets Sharon Olds and Warden Shire in the Penguin Modern Poets series, edition 3, which is On Your Family, Your Body, published in 2017. And the poem Nine Nights was published in the Poetry Review in the autumn 2016, was shortlisted for the best single poem in the 2017 Forward Prize in the UK. Malaika currently hosts and curates the People Tree Press's literary podcast, a Cave Canem Fellow, and the inaugural poet in residence of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Malaika was awarded the Chumley Award in 2019 for outstanding contribution to poetry, and a poem, The Little Miracles, commissioned by and published in Magna 75, won the Forward Prize for Best Single Poem in 2020. She received her MA from Goldsmith University and has recently begun her PhD in creative writing at the University of Newcastle. Malaika, what a pleasure and treat to have you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. My God, I was sitting here like so cross with Tony. I thought, how can you end? This is where the unraveling begins. I was just like, okay. I just like, you know, when the storyteller's telling you something and they say, this is where the unraveling begins, and you kind of lean back waiting for, and then he just went, thank you. And I was like, no, that was really beautiful and really graphic. And also thank you, Sudeep, for giving us the time and space to have a collective silence and acknowledge what's happening out in the world. So without further ado, I'm going to start reading. I'm just going to set my timer. And I'm going to share some poems with you. The first poem I'm going to share is called Windwashed Acoustics, and it was commissioned by Fuel Theatre. Several poets were commissioned to write towards the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I responded to Article 19, no one shall be subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. And I thought that's quite ironic with what's happening with the Windrush generation being forcibly removed from Britain. Windrush Acoustics. Because the custom men came fishing at daybreak, trapped me in their nest. Because on that plain we were shoals of fresh-faced fish, nettled but not wiggling, passive with the shock. Because my security burst like a balloon, pieces scattered at this shame. Because now I'm trapped in this stinking sand of bureaucracy. Because now John Crows congregate on the green lawn of my prayers, like vultures dancing on my coffin. Oh Lord, dancing on my coffin. Because my local MP's promises are trickier than the emperor's new clothes. And the weight of his failed promises presses me into sinking sand. Because the custom men watched me, scorn, twisting up their face like I was septic tank. And I wanted to tell them, Home was like this when I first arrived, to the signs, no dogs, no dogs. Because I traveled on my mother's British passport, how in them days she was British, how in them days I was British, and we were home. Because it was just last week, I finished pay off the mortgage for my little Croydon home. And now they're ripping my flesh, and Lord, this cut jagged. Because yesterday my grandson cried, come home, Nana, please come home. But sunshine went on strike and night have no light. So what flame could I spark for that little boy? Because it was only last week when I pick him up from nursery, his teacher, Miss Williams, say, some of these kids come to school with no food in their bellies, and teaching them is like pouring water on marble. It will not soak. And I thought they had it bad, not knowing that this week it would come to this.
Ooh, marvelous.
Thank you. And this poem is called The Garden of Gethsemane, and it was commissioned over Easter by BBC Radio. Each poet was given us a particular aspect of Jesus' journey during that Easter week to respond to, and I was given the night before when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. I cannot tell you what the trees whispered to him that night. Air ripe with the scent of living, fruits pungent, leaves clapping, harmonizing with the cricket's rhythmic screech. What could trees whisper to a Black man juggling sorrow on the eve of his catastrophe, face tortured, back bent from the weight of prophecy, kneeling in damp soil, thoughts wrestling, each worry a serrated knife gorging flesh. Say he was weeping, beating his chest, murmuring, big man don't cry, wanting to unshackle from his father's heirloom. But what papa does not force their son into a square box, each corner reinforced with the black tar of hardening expectations? And the garden was not a tonic. When he spoke to the leaves, did they not turn their backs, curl their spine to recede into their own nourishment, leaving him to keep his own vigil on this seemingly ordinary night, the eve of his prophesied death? And those disciples, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here and watch with me, he asked them. Oh, those fickle hard-aired men, how their snores became bass in the ripe music of this garden, how they will regret not catching the tremor in his voice, the slight wave at each pause. Regret will sit heavy on their chest whenever they remember this garden and not reading the nuances, his pathos, between each utterance of his asking. Sit ye here while I go to pray, meaning sit so we can converse in the language of grief, meaning it is my last night with you. Let us partake in the language of wake, lick down dominoes and make old talk. Come the man, meaning be my brothers tonight. Come lick down double six and rock the table, disturb the still of the night. He wanted old talk, lime and labrish, my soul exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. But his brother's snores mingled with the owl's hoots, and the leaves turned their backs, while his kinfolk sprawl out in sleep. The nails, bones breaking, splintering, bearing timber on your back like a donkey carrying load. Say he's weeping, beating his chest, murmuring, big man don't cry. Mourning his lack of ordinariness, mourning his body will not rot, worm and decay, maggots will not feed on his flesh. Now his palms dig into the soil, earth in fingernails, sifting the dirt man's flesh is molded from, burying this sorrowful weight, then standing as the stuttering light of morning approaches. Thank you.
Bravo.
Bravo.
Thank you. I know that's
Well
high
done,
praise
Elijah.
coming from you. I remember in when I was in Delhi, when I read poetry, people would say, bravo. In the midst of the apocalypse, I found myself writing a lot of poems where doors are being marked with chalk that have this biblical thing. It seems to be the only way I can handle speaking about COVID. In the midst of the apocalypse, doors have been marked with orange chalk, bodies fortified with ginger and garlic tea, yet grief still trails the filthy hems of their long dresses into our doorways. They march in, a battalion of female dolls with hollow bodies, buxom hips, shaped like the hips of bells. The bells toil in Brooklyn, Birmingham, and Brent, but makes no sound as their tongues have been plucked out. Is a bell with no toiling tongue still a bell? We West Indians cannot bury our dead, so gather stones from local parks to consult with our ancestors. But the stones roll back to their resting places disgruntled. The weight of no night feels like the flay of the devil's whip lashing our skins, and the stones want no part of it. This reminder of lynchings and whippings, of hangings like bunch bananas from sturdy tree branches. Spirits can be vengeful, and I suspect our ancestors are the worst if their expectations from the living have not been met. My brother tells me how he and 7 friends gathered stones and rocks for months, piling them in pre-planned spots until the first moonless night, when they parked themselves by their mounds of stones to pelt their headmaster's rooftop. I imagine the relentless rain of stones, the battering roof, and the young man curled with his family, palms on ears. His only crime was to discipline the unruly. Will our ancestors, not fortified with socially isolated libations of white rum and no 9 nights, rain stones onto our roofs too, as they, like the schoolboys, lack understandings of human laws and restrictions? Thank you.
Wonderful, Malaka, wonderful.
Thank
Can't
you.
say bravo. Can't say bravo.
Bravo. Well, I'll say bravo from Washington.
And God, I remember Sudeep, when I was in Delhi, coming to you with my scrawling poems for you to help me and work through with me, to mentor me. You were one of my mentors. It's so fantastic to actually read poems, to kind of illustrate to you how much I've grown, I suppose, as a writer. So it feels really wonderful to be reading and to be hearing you give feedback.
Not at all. It's sweet and a pleasure. We are all very, very proud of you.
Thank you. I couldn't write at the beginning of lockdown last year. And so I started writing with Roger Robinson and Nick McCaw, 2 other poets, and another poet called Trey. And what we would do is we would dedicate ourselves to writing 3 to 4 poems a week. And on the Monday of the next week, we would email them to each other. And we didn't matter if they were rubbish or whatever, it was just getting them done. And I remember sitting on my desk thinking, I don't know what to write today. And I realized that this bird at 4 o'clock would always land on the fence. And I thought, okay, we'll follow the bird. We'll call this points of this reckoning, and we'll see what reckoning I'll do with the bird. So this is the poem, Points of This Reckoning. 1, outside the poet's window, a black and white bird stalks the concrete fence daily like clockwork, his black feathers resplendent against the gray aging concrete. 2, the poet wonders if this is a symbol, and if yes, what is the bird symbolic of? 3, what omen is the bird delivering, strutting outside the poet's doorstep like a postman? 4, the poet wishes she had the visa to decipher the bird's prophecy. 5, the poet reaches out to her dead aunt, wishing she was alive, with her tea leaves, dream interpretations, and answers to every sacred message sent, but receives no answer. 6, today wise Windrush elders like her aunt are dying. The news runs amok with these disproportionate deaths. 7, the poets heard whispers circulating that these elders harvested dreams of phlegm-soaked threads embroidering throats, but ignored the literal connotations of these visions, projecting them onto the Windrush deportations, a costly distraction. 8, the citizens marked their homes and those of their carers with orange chalk, but to no avail. That suffuses their lungs like cheese fermenting. 9. The poet marvels at the furtiveness of this virus, its pugnacious nature. 10. This phantom made many West Indians in the diaspora sign themselves, sighing, "Doppie no who fi frighten." 11. The poet notices how the language proverb are a sort of chameleon, a camouflage, or rather, thinking the idea through, how circumstances change even the wording of this traditional Jamaican proverb. Because in these serious times, Doppie move beyond frightened to Doppie don't care who for dead. 12. The poet's sister-in-law is one of the brown-skinned workers whose job has radically transformed to key, from unappreciated to homage songs and applause. 13. The poet's sister-in-law states Brooklyn has the highest body count, says no one collects the bodies. They are told to put the corpse into another room and lock the door. Is this the same for the whites, the poet asks. The bodies, the orderlies are weeping, fatigued, so much death. 14. Long ago, before funeral parlors, West Indians kept their dead bodies at home and washed and prepared their dead for burial. Someone sat with the body so it was not alone. Back then, the body was buried quick. 15. In Chapeltown, policemen circle young Black men like rabid hyenas. The poet watches as at 4 p.m. like clockwork, they begin to circle. 16. The poet asks, Bird, did you come as a messenger about this hunter situation? Is that why you stalk? Then the poet apologizes. 16. 17. Apologies, Bird. The poet humbly mumbles. This is my projection onto you. I beg you, grant me a visa to be able to read your vision. And I have time for one last poem, and I'm going to stick in a small poem called The Ecosystem of Her Tears. I was reading a newspaper article, and it was about this young woman who was cleaning the tomb of her ancestors. I think it was in China, and these bees flew into her eyes. And basically, the newspaper said that these bees, they're attracted to salt. So they were attracted to tears of her, the salt of her tears. And I thought that was so poetic. And I really loved the way they talked about how the doctor handled trying to take these bees out so that he wouldn't kill them. So this poem I'm going to end on is called The Ecosystem of Her Tears. Our tears are an ecosystem of eyeballs, yellow sun and dust. Our bodies turn to dust in death to replenish as Earth's food. Gathered in eyeballs, feed bees like pollen, like water, like our bodies. Grief's obese body is hollow with emptiness. Her currency is the soap opera called death, where our tears salt oceans, when we visit gravesites or tombs. Like hers fell as she swept her ancestors' resting place in that tomb, when bees drawn like magnets by the scent of salt flew into her eyes, then crawled behind her contacts to binge drink tears. Foregathered, not budged by eye washing, the feasting four gorged, the way grief gorges loss, until the eye doctor gently pulled their legs with tweezers to release these bees into the breeze whole. Such value in the little ordinariness, like how gentle they all were. She sweeping that tomb, bees snacking at their self-made table in her eyes, and that doctor pulling with a lightness that blooms like salt. Thank you very much for inviting me to read. Here, it's been such a pleasure to share these new poems with you.
Malika, thank you very much. Wonderful. You know, I have to say you're cooking this morning. I'm enjoying the food. Thank
Yes,
you.
I was going to say that, it's not unsurprising that the first pamphlet was called Breadfruit, followed by Pepper Seed, food. But your poetry is leapt and leapt and leapt like the sort of surging Afro-Caribbean ocean, and it's now food for the mind and soul. And
It
it's
was really
biblical.
brilliant.
in its
Correct. Very
standard.
powerful.
Wonderful,
It's
wonderful.
It's absolutely fantastic, Malika. I've not heard you read before. I've known of your poetry and read it in books. And now to just listen to you is amazing. Thank you.
Yeah,
And
thank you
Malika,
so
one
much.
more thing I want to just say quickly is it's interesting what you've done from, you started off very much, according to me, as a performance poet, very much a performance poet. And the way now you've used that skill and also incorporated all the skills of a page poet, brilliant. Because I think many poets get trapped in one or the other, and very few can sort of, incorporate the two. And it's quite something. Brilliant. What a
Yeah,
revolution.
and I'll
Not
just
to
add,
use a biblical term.
Malika, I'll also add as an editor of a poetry journal, the Beltway
Yes.
Poetry Quarterly, we're waiting for your poems whenever you feel like sending some. Thank you. Thank
I
you
just
very much.
remember, thank you. I just remember like you invited me for dinner in Delhi and me coming to your house with all these little poems on paper and us working through them. And you said, and I had a reading and you said, this is India. You have to put together, you have to put these in a, type them up and put them in a pamphlet. And I remember that I just didn't understand what you were saying. I mean, I'm here to write. And then that night at the reading, the poems sold like hotcake. Everyone was just buying them. So yes, it feels really good to read with you here and also with Kendall here too, who I admire his work. But thank you.
I hope I wasn't too ruthless because I chopped off lots of lines and words there. But that's
Oh
all
no,
right.
you were wonderfully ruthless. Wonderfully. I love it.
But talking about the bird, I have to read this little quote from one of my favorite poets, Chesraf Mirosh, because the bird inspired you to keep going because you were not writing. And for me, this is the mantra for these times. And this is just 3 short lines. And Milosh writes, "My generation was lost, cities too, and nations. But this a little later. Meanwhile, in the window, a swallow."
Thank you. Thank you, Malika.
Beautiful.
Malika, I just have to
Beautiful.
say also, here in the United States, we have a poet, Wallace Stevens, and his poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. So here you've opted up to 17, and you've made a wonderful poem. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now we will move on now to another wonderful poet, an old friend, Ron Price, who is reading to us from New York, where he's the poet teacher at the Juilliard School. Ron has a long history in American poetry with, which also has to do with performance. I mean, and the page and teaching and the poem remembered. He has hundreds of poems in memory on his tongue, and it's just a real pleasure to just spend minutes, hours with him, just listening to him recite a kind of American and poetry canon. He was a close friend of Etheridge Knight, and Etheridge Knight is one of the great poets of our time, and he's been a teacher at Juilliard and elsewhere. And he used to share poems with me in the early 90s, and I with him in cafes in the village, and very fond recollections of the editing process, which was kind but severe. And so thank you, Ron, for those contributions. I think one of the first poems in my first book was, I remember, I shaved the last line, and there it stood, and there it stands now. Ron Price, I think the bio is in the chat. As I said, he's teaching artist at the Juilliard School. He's been a past visiting poet for the United States visiting poets in Belgium and in India. And he has worked under the auspices of the Artists Respond to Terror program. He's given talks on American culture and poetry at the American Center in Jerusalem. His poetry collections include Surviving Brothers, A Crucible for the Left Hand, a small song called Ash from the Fire, and a true account of the failure of bodies to adequately burn. One of our finest poets, Ronald Price. Go ahead, Ron.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't have any kind of order to these poems that I'm going to read. They just seem to be talking to each other, and I put them together because of that. The first poem is called A True Account of the Failure of Bodies to Adequately Burn. Into the ruined elm standing like a legend created by the survivor of his disease, down into the roots under memory's foundation of smoke, the folly, a fool's hope. Isn't that why a singer turns to look back? If a pillar of salt isn't about failure of faith or nerve, maybe it's about grief, a sense of place lost, except in the chest of the one left to carry it, to sing it into the living, to make a place for it, for the mind of the dead among red poppies and sacks of rage, that the stones in the field and the dried blood on the stones go down into the earth, the true faith. Grief always leads toward renewal money cannot buy, that longing to disappear into what? An elm tree, shade, a triangulation of heartache, genestra, and breath billowed with the conviction, what if? Perhaps then, maybe, before death, I'm sorry, what did you say? I dream of an unbuckling that might enable twisted legs to dance instead of everything lingering like an abscess. Because finally, singing isn't enough to make the dawn begin, though something is. If not blood drawn down into the earth, if not to lie among stones and moles burrowed into the ground, then why? For what? Tell me a story.
Brilliant. Fantastic.
This next piece is called First Story. What I meant to say got lost in the river. It rose from the shoreline among tree stumps, beer cans and cigarette butts, shards of bottled glass, the abandoned skin of a water moccasin. It drifted off, hovering above the water as if to compose itself, started to whirl and spin, got sucked below in the seething drag and swinge of an undertow. I must have stood a long time on the shore while traffic crossed the bridge driving into the evening sun. I knew what I did not say then. I knew the river said it better. It had to do with beginning and ending and beginning again. The snake, the beautiful snake, said it, milky with the paste of mucus and dead cells slipping from under a cracked slab of concrete in ragged, undulant lines toward the water, as if it were hungry and knew what to do. It went into the river, looking for a frog or a fish, or maybe to avoid the heel of a son of Adam.
Oof. Bravo, bravo.
This next poem is called Nankana Pastoral. Nankana County is roughly about 50 miles south of Memphis and about 40 miles north of Memphis. And it's a Chickasaw term that means at one and the same time, home and going home. Nankana Pastoral. Something the color of copper clung to the stones each time the creek dried up. And when it froze, ice reflected the tinge of sunset. Where the crawdads went at such times never troubled my sleep. How could they matter as other than food baiting a hook? My father taught his sons well. 5 or 6 empty Campbell soup cans, each weighted with a stone, and strung across the creek bed, open end facing the current, straining through nail holes at the opposite end, a crawdad powerless against the moon, wielding the creek's current until it reeled to stasis in Cobb's Lake. I never understood that copper tinge. Forget it, my father smiled. We're all food, he said, angling a fishhook into the crawdad's belly. This is called Eros. She's talking, maybe laughing. We sit on the back porch steps under the mimosa beside the strawberry patch. I can call back the timbre of her voice, bees and clover, her thighs and shorts. After weeding the bed, I helped my mother plant. We fill a small bowl. She is teaching her boy to weed and hull, dipping in cream each strawberry she offers him. Look at them, two innocents in a world that eats innocence. We sit on the back porch steps, the little garden, the ample universe.
Yeah, the universe.
This next one is called You Think You Know. A long day without luck until the other switched to sunfish. I'm after that bass, Ricky Lee said with a smile. A long day of heat and beer without lunch, and now in their shack, making dinner and drinking whiskey with branch water, while the Cardinals lose on the radio and Bernstein going on about his wife. She brainwashed my son and my daughter. Everyone knows she threw him out. He'll spend summer as the spring before testifying. The woman, you think you know, he says, the woman turned my son and daughter against me. Well, he says, that's done now. And you, he paused, his eyes a focused haze of whiskey. You fuckwit warts, every one of you wedded to failure. Fisherman, go ahead, sneer. You think you're going to escape being crucified by the facts of your life? I have this group that's ongoing. And they're loosely titled 10,000 Memos. And this is 5 memos. Memo 6,278. A man runs a few miles, sweating through his clothes, unashamed. Number 1,083. Honeysuckle, and every leaf on the vine brown as the head of a horsefly. 4,516. Standing at the crossroads, one wants one way. There isn't. Number 743. Pouring out a bucket of turpentine on the honeysuckle bush. She knew what she was doing. 9,397. This light is like no other. The silhouette of branches thrashing the window, the moon smiling with its one tooth.
Terrific.
This is called the New Jerusalem of the Heart. When the Lord calls out at dusk, I push my chair away from the desk and listen to a brood of wild turkeys feeding on worms and wet grass. The turkeys breathe gently, attentive to the least rustle of weeds, where they know the fox will come if he comes. It is beginning autumn, and I am tempted toward my childhood among chickens and turkeys, the hen's neck wrung by my father's hand for Thanksgiving. Dawn began with a stain drop of birdsong. All day I've been brooding on an image to match the wreckage my hand has wrought. I know the fox must eat, and the turkeys near the green shed, the neighbors' chickens, and beyond the tree line, the black bears in the woods. I know it. Despite the crow's caw, its resident ache in my ear, I know we live and die by laws my father did not write. This next piece is called First Spring After the End. It had nothing to do with blood or guilt, nothing to do with family. I wanted a small personal voice under stars no closer, the moon no further off than millennia before, where the good earth continues according to its time, the ground not paved with ice and anxiety because it is still winter. I needed to connect with something older than beginning. There is a moment, and when it comes, we lie down between cypress knees or keep on. Meaning, I suppose, whatever it is that tells a man, your mother's loving arms can no longer protect you. I felt sick. I was sick of a God who does nothing to heal what his love has wounded. I felt battered. It made a hole, an absence I understand as the presence of God in the universe. I kept explaining to no one in particular, if it were more than air these hands keep reaching through, then it would not be this room of gray light, and this weight would not feel like a stone divided by falling rain. Still winter, though a mood in my body like the need to care and not care had begun to thaw. All afternoon, redwings chased crows away from their nests among the reeds, along the marsh where mallards drifted, a place to find my anxiety that keeps expressing itself through the seasons that pass without end, the flowers that bloom without reason, early meadow rue, yellow genestra, blue forget-me-not, lilac. I think I've got time for about one more. This is called The Lost Child Counting the Found. Vines of philodendron leaves draped around the window frame winter light otherwise. I should start over and mention something first. There is a strange entryway into a hut in the middle of this poem that belongs to a Russian fairy tale about a character named Baba Yaga. Vines of philodendron leaves draped around the window frame winter light otherwise. I can't recall the last time I noticed a water tower, or when I last honored the hag who sneers at my face in the mirror. She connects me to things larger than I am alone, and I could use her help now. All day I've been tangled in chicken claws without a door to pass through. Set one foot on the floor, bend and place the other on the ceiling. So I honor the willingness of water to rise and fall, to flow, and honor the crude, that vulgar thing, the willingness to keep on though the hurt child accuse her, accuse me. No one is innocent. I lost the keys to our apartment once it stopped feeling like home. Isn't that how each beginning entails a loss? Mistrust multiplying like spider eggs, what's partial, blossoming. Let melting sleet and snow slush our arguments as only the dead can clarify. What wants to live comes unbidden as you came, Xiao Xia. The cow's eye, the goat's hoof, they know what the limb of any pear tree knows. Listen, and you'll hear rising from the rootstocks the anonymous, unashamed buds of one trunk's dark need to blossom into more than flower and leaf. Thank you.
Magnificent, Ron. Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, I have to ask you, I mean, you are an American poet. Now that's, like, one can say it's a matter of geography, or it's a matter of where you were born. But I mean it also in terms of the flora and fauna you write about in your poems. Now, of course, there are this yellow genestra, this blue forget-me-not, this lilac that you finished that poem with. And then this man or this character in your poems who's in these landscapes. And so I'm just trying to ask you to just to talk about a little bit about landscape and the nature and the geography of the poems you've shared with us, and because to me, I know you are an encyclopedic reader and you read from many places and many cultures and books in translation and so on. So I was wondering whether there is a particular American nature that is typical, that is your sort of field of expertise and what you present to the language through your poems. I hope it's not too broad, or I just wanted to ask you a question that will get you to share some of your thoughts about the poet and nature and landscape and geography. Go ahead.
Well, I guess the place to start is that I don't consider myself a nature poet. I think that nature poet has been supplanted now by ecological poetry. There was that poem, non-kind of primitive. Something the color of copper clung to the stones each time the creek dried up. My father didn't tell me that the land was being polluted by an airport that was about a mile away. And that pollution was showing up in the streams. And then when the stream freezes, you could see the orange tinge in the ice. And it looked like sunrise or sunset. So it was at once something beautiful and something terrible at the same time. And I am interested always in trying to put those two together in one piece.
The terrible beauty of being born. Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, but yes.
Yeah.
Ron, one of the things that struck me, and I think it struck a lot of people, because if you see the chat box completely simmering with enthusiasm and bubbling with praise, is the way you end your poems. My God, it's like a knockout punch. These are fabulously sort of well-intoned couplets often, or just sort of a parallel phraseology which sort of goes woof. That's one thing. You can talk about that, whether you give a lot of thought to the ending and whether the endings of your poems are very important. The other thing I have to say, which struck me, and I had the privilege of reading the poems before because I had the Word document, which always is helpful, is the way you use syntactical elements. It is really brave. You can, if someone can get away with a comma, space, and an ampersand following it. I mean, if I give it to a professor of poetry or a poet, they'll say, what is this? But you just carry it off. So there are these two completely disparate things I'm talking about. Perhaps you want to just throw some light on it.
Yeah, I don't know about the ampersand part. Luckily, I'm at Juilliard, so I don't deal with a lot of academics.
So you deal with notations.
Yes, I'm dealing with notations and I'm dealing with musical phrasing. Yes. rather than an iambic line or a Whitman-esque line. But I'm not really sure where to go with this. I'm not really sure what you're asking me about.
I was asking you whether, in fact, you give a lot of thought to your endings of your poems.
I give a lot of myself to every one of my poems. And that also includes all of the bad ones, which are among the larger group. But I'm guessing probably that my two main teachers were William Butler Yeats and Etheridge Knight. And neither of them had a tendency to land lightly.
Yes, go on, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, the other commonality so far has been all three writers. The vocabulary and the and the engine of reading, beautiful flow of words. All three of you read so beautifully. That's such a treat, really.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely agree. It has been
Thank-
wonderful.
Thank you. It's an important part for me. When you ask if I think about endings a lot, I don't think about endings a lot, but what I do think about is the noise that the poem is making all the way through itself. And that I hear better out loud than reading to myself. So doing readings is like, well, I'll give you an example. In the first spring after the end, I have a stanza that says, I was sick of a God who does nothing to heal what his love has wounded. I felt battered, so much failure and betrayal and death. It made a hole, an absence I understood as the presence of God in the universe. I have so much failure and death, and I dropped it. And I wasn't planning on dropping it, but I knew it didn't belong there, and it had been bothering me for a long time. And what happens when I read out loud is I have a very accurate editor who doesn't want me to say something stupid. And the editor just took over and crossed out that part, because there's nothing wrong with what it says, but it's prose. And it's not part of the poem.
No.
What a wonderful way to end your comment too, just the way you end your poems.
Thank you.
Really brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks.
We should, another round of applause.
Another round of applause. Thank you.
Yes.
So-
Finally, I've already been accused of being terribly biased to St. Lucians. We have yet another St. Lucian here today. I'm generally biased about good poetry. I wonder why it comes out of certain continents more than the others. Oops, I'm not going to venture more on that comment. Kendall, your bio is on the side. It's judiciously very short. So I'm going to make it even shorter. Because this man is an incredibly accomplished man. So it's very difficult to, put it in 5 lines. But let me just read out bits of it. Kendall Hippolyte is a poet, playwright, and a director and sporadic researcher in areas of St. Lucian and Caribbean arts and culture. Retired lecturer in literature and theater, he is a poet and dramatist. His poetry has been published internationally in journals, anthologies, and 6 volumes between 1980 and 2012. His writing explores the spectrum of standard and Caribbean English, working with traditional forms, free verse, and forms influenced by popular culture. He's the winner of the 2013 Bocas Festival Poetry Prize. His most recent book is Word Planting, published by People Tree Press. And I have to say, there are lots of People Tree people around here. And many of my early books were also published by People Tree. In fact, Jeremy and Hannah should be joining this program every time. He's been a judge on the panels for the Small Axe Poetry Prize, the Bocas Festival Poetry Prize, and the very, very generous, massive prize, which is the Montreal Poetry Prize, which gives you a lot of money for one poem, I believe. In 2000, Kendall was awarded the St. Lucia Medal of Merit Gold for contribution to the arts. Retired from Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, where he taught literature and theater. His present focus is to use his skills as a writer and dramatist to raise public awareness and contribute to active solutions of critical social issues. Kendall, it's really a pleasure, always a pleasure to have you and to hear your poetry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shredeep. And I want to thank all the three poets who came before. It really has been a blessing and food in Malaika's sense of poetry food to listen to the three of you before. So give thanks for that. Give thanks to Shredeep, Indran for creating this forum for us. Thanks. Okay, going to jump straight in. The first poem I'll do is called Mach 1, and very quick preface to that is sometime maybe second decade or so of the 2000s, I began writing a small suite or sequence of poems in which some of what I see as the forces of not just modern history, but showing up itself in our times. I began to personify them. So like in the sense that you have the seven cardinal sins, gluttony and lust and so on. I began to personify these forces in history as Mac this and Mac that. They were all called Mac something like, like McAllister for cruelty and so on. So so Mac 1, Mac 2, Mac 3. So we're gonna read Mac 1, and this is Mac wanting. What he's most wanting is not what he wants, is not what he craves. Deeper than avarice, if he'd let himself feel, is the haunting hunger that saves. He holds the whole world with his hired hands, desperately trying to have it, but trapped in his spasming grip, his seizures, the earth is dying. He cannot stop grasping. Whatever he sees, he is accounting itself into cost, into price, into sale, into profit, into himself. Mac wanting. He gluts till he's racked with a spasm and spews blood-flecked bits of self. A wasting consumption, leaving him gasping for life and clutching at pelf. What is the deep hole he's trying to fill? For what is he hungry? Gorged with the planet's green flesh, its black bile, its ripped out entrails, and yet empty. Running to everything and running everything, avoiding the whole he's afraid that will swallow him into its void, where he has no thing, no soul. And yet he touches us, Midas like, desperately haunted and haunting. And we, his children, we bear his name like a watermark, secretly, Mac wanting. Woo! The other one is called Really. Issues of so-called sanity and insanity, how does that come about? Have haunted me from long time, from childhood, and there's personal family reasons for that. And it's a continuing exploration for me. This is called Really. Really. One of the city's madmen, a new one, as the car eases past the traffic light, takes rapid aim, fires, pumps, fires again, a direct hit. The car smashes the bridge, broadside, half spins, crashes the other side, breaching the suddenly buckled girders, goes right over, bonnet first, into the muddy, stinking river. This is not what we see. we see a lunatic gesticulating an exact mime of a shotgun murder. Fantasy, a comic unreality, where thoughts are triggering blank acts that leave reality unharmed. He is pathetic, that sniper into our world. His thoughts ricochet off our rare windscreen back at him. He drops out of our sight, diminishing in the mirror. It's later, alone, I realize I have been hit. It shocks through me. The understanding in a wondered moment that for him, it was real. For where he really lives, this happened. More that where we live is that same place. For considering what lies between our thought and act, the dream, the life, where do we live truly? If what touches, what we touch with at the core is not, though it may seem that way, the act, but the thought felt intangible tip of what becomes the act. If spirit, not flesh, emotion, not action, is our substance, where else is there to live in truth but in that place where he, the ineffectual murderer madman, lived when he fired dream-lethal thoughts at us, at what we felt was our reality. I had a kind of a wry laugh, smile of recognition when Ron mentioned about, you know, he's kind of keeping, well, that he's not very much into the academic mode. I have a very, very watchful and cautious relationships with the world of academia. I recognize this necessity. I'm glad it's there, but I have, you know, I have my skepticisms. And the whole trend in literary criticism for the last, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so has my head spinning. So this is called Trialectics and the Problematic of the Formulaic Paradigm, Paradigmatic Formulae in the Poetry of, well, whoever.
No wonder he was talking about academia there.
Felt I should write something poetic. Not great verse necessarily, just, you know, nifty. You know? So definitely not an epic. Felt I should write something poetic. And I thought, well, why not trialectic? So there, need not be dissed or discussed. Felt I should write something poetic. Not great verse necessarily, just.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you, Kendall.
It's so difficult to bring humor in serious poetry.
Yeah,
It's necessary.
it's necessary. No, it's absolutely, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, last couple coming up. This is called Advice to a Young Poet. And it begins with an epigram from Tefra Milosh. I was glad to see glad to see and hear Sudeep referencing him earlier. A line from Tefra Milosh says, "What is poetry that does not save nations or people?" ask the question, not once, but 49 times. And perhaps at the 50th, you will make an answer, or perhaps not. Then ask it again. This time till 70 times 7. Ask as you open the door of every book of poems that you enter. Ask it of every poem, regardless of how beautiful, that whispers, lie with me. Do not spare your newborn. If the first cry, first line is not a wailing for an answer, abandon it. As for the stillborn, turn the next blank white sheet over. Shroud it. Ask the clamoring procession of all the poems of the ages, each measured white-haired epic, every flouncing free verse debutant, to state their names, where they have come from, and what their business is with you. You live in the Kaisera of our times, the sound of nations, persons breaking around you. If poetry can only save itself, then who will hear it after it has fled from the nations and the people that it could not save even a remnant of for a remembering?
Oh my God. That's a
It's called-
chilling poem. Then.
This is called Lines on the Sidewalk. Where the sidewalk splits, where grass cracks an unexpected gash across the concrete surface, where the unseen black broil of earth seethes upward, starting green fires flickering on these cemented urban ways now fractured. There, a fault line of possibility where new breaks into knowing. And you sense your eyes warm, wide open from and to a light, inciting you to, for the first time, yet again, see. See. That no matter how much, how often, how long we slab the earth, she will breach us, grab back her ground from our suave hands trying to smooth her over. See that underneath our feet, she is convulsing, roots, rocks wrestling each other in the dirt that worms blur through in an unsounded subterranean aeonic gnash of elements. See that, like the silent, unseen furying of the caterpillar struggling to beyond itself, Earth is a metamorphosis. And what she will finally become is hidden from us. That wry quirk in the sidewalk that the grass has suddenly blazed from between one day and the next, it seems, has let through a momentary light, an insight. A true civilization builds a way of living at the seeming fault between humanity's fulfillment and nature's. And perhaps if all our ways were like old flagstone paths, acknowledging the grass growing between our footsteps, as well as the going of our feet, we might eventually reach a different destination. But as things are now, I think the sidewalk should remain cracked, for the quick green flames to flicker their almost unnoticed light that briefly, imperfectly, relumes another way. And the last piece is called Archipelago. I really believe the Caribbean is an absolutely, there's a sense in which obviously every place is unique. Every culture is unique, every era is unique in one sense. But I really do have a sense of a very, very special destiny and that there is something called Caribbean civilization. There's a poem of faith. It's called Archipelago. If you really see the Caribbean archipelago, you will see yourself. The vivid scattered islands, stirring to awakening in a sea of reverie and nightmare. The goldening light, lifting green foliage out of darkness into its illumination. And the surrounding blue immensity, brooding an unknown creaturing of what can live only in depth. If you hear the Caribbean archipelago, you will hear it talking to you in tongues of the original tribes of the Americas, Africa, Europe, Asia. You will hear quarreling, then a blur. And you will hear the simultaneous translation of these languages into the first language, the sea talking to itself. Because in the beginning and the end, there is no other. If you truly see the Caribbean archipelago, it will become clear how the fragmented, brittle arc of islands, resisting the onsurge of ocean, makes islands, makes the sea. How the ocean, reaching around breached rock, trying to rejoin itself, makes islands. How they both therefore define each other. How they refine your understanding of the selfhood into an acceptance of the necessary oneness of the known and the unknown. If you can be the Caribbean archipelago, acknowledging that your littoral shape is never final, that it shifts with your awareness that below the sublunary rise and ebb, there is an undertow, a contrary flow that draws you down, deepening to where the separate islands reach beyond the scattered stones of their selves, growing down back into one bedrock, into the original ground from which the sea, the ocean, the self-dismembered yet defining archipelago rise into their being. If you can be this, be beyond it, you will miracle into impossibility. You will see how to be broken and yet whole.
Bravo, 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 bravo. My goodness me. How to be broken and yet whole. Thank you. Thank you, Kendall.
Thank you.
Malika.
Thank you. Magnificent.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Tony. My God, every time Indran and I do this, we say it's been the best episode. Every time we do this, the level just rises. And today, I think you guys brought the sea with you, the oceans. Everything churned. Even the landlocked poems churned in its belly. I don't know. I'm so moved, actually, really. But one thing beyond, and we're not supposed to show our emotion, men, more so women, all this crappy stuff. But one thing I do want to say, Kendall, I've read you on the page separately and intensely, and I've heard you live. I've never actually followed your reading and the poems side by side, which I was doing today because they were all on the side. And what I noticed was you're a master of how to intone and how to pause, because every grammatical signpost in your poetry is exactly the way you read it. It's very rare that people follow line breaks and commas to the T, because every reading you can change it, of course. But the way you measure your iams and dactyls and praise songs, brilliant.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for this beautiful song.
Thank you.
It's the universal song, the literal shape. I remember I picked that up. Isn't that a title of an anthology? The literal shape, St. Lucian anthology, perhaps. I may be wrong.
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh, okay.
I would just like to add, go ahead, Sweet.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just what a pleasure it was to hear the poem about the academic tendencies of the last 20 years.
Ouch.
You know, there's a tradition in Spanish poetry called the anti-poetria, you know. Nicanor Parra is often cited as the great anti-poet. But anyway, I just think it's refreshing, yes, but it's unnecessary. But how can we stop what's going on in the academia? Afterwards, you say, once this monster is out of the bottle, you know, and the need to publish, and you know, is such a compelling need in the academic world, the criticism. The poet or the poetry, or it's just it's almost expendable, you know. It doesn't really matter as long as there's enough in there to support the theory of the language. I mean, I don't know. Have you taught classes as well? I mean, have you been invited into the academy once in a while to?
I do, but always to things like do workshops. So I was going on my terms, but they're very clear.
Right.
The way in which I want to fit into it. I don't quarrel with academia. That's not my business too. It's, you know, I suppose it has to do what it has to do. I don't know, but yeah, it has to do what it has to do. I have to do what I have to do. That's it. Yeah.
But but I think the poet and critic, you know, that role, the public role of what you do, because what you do, you also make plays and you put them on a stage, and you know, so you have a function in the society that is I just very different from the academic in the ivory tower. You know, I don't know. I just think you are. Thank God that you are doing what you're doing, and you seem to have a relatively magnanimous attitude towards allowing the others to go on their way. But I fear that sometimes people, you know, if our goal is to bring more readers to poetry and people to poetry and so on, we need more on the outside workers like yourself writing and sharing your work. I'm curious also about if you could talk a little bit about playwriting and poetry, you know, because there's, of course, in St. Lucia, you know, there was Derek Walcott, who was a playwright and a poet, and I think you know, Shakespeare wrote plays and poetry. Can you just speak about a little bit about putting the poems on the stage and how, and that side of your work a little bit?
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I just want to hark back very quickly to Sudeep's remark about reading poems or performing the poems. Yeah, I mean, I'm a dramatist, and I so I mean, I'm practically involved in it. I also did some training, some actor training, that kind of thing. So and Ron's comment early on, and Sudeep talking about Malaika at one stage being more of a performance poet. Poetry sound. Poetry begins to sound, language begins to sound. You know, when I'm teaching poetry workshops, I always tell people, listen, don't let the word writer confuse you. You know, the writing is making marks on paper to capture sound, language begins and ends at sound. So that's the first thing, that's always uppermost in my mind, in making final judgments about the shape of the poems and that kind of thing. And yes, I guess my own background as a director, as a playwright, you've got, half an hour, hour and a half on the stage, which you've got to hold people there with everything at your disposal. But the language is very often one of the key elements, and therefore there's ways in which the sound have to work that conforms to what I think of as almost like psychological laws or pressures, put it that way too. So yes, so yeah, I don't see that there has to be a big artificial division between, say, spoken word and the written word. You always gain more when you've got a chance to look at it at your leisure and peruse it at more leisure. That's fine. That's great. So it's great that it's written. But to me, there's a kind of a rule of thumb almost for me that you're doing like a new poem. You've got this audience that you'll only have one time ever. They'll never ever hear the poem again. You'll never have this audience again. And there'll be only this one chance to voice it out loud. What are they going to get? What's going to be left of them? What the sounds that you make and how you make them? What's going to be left of them after that one and only ever reading? It's a kind of a rule of thumb for me. I mean, that cannot be applied 100% because some of the poem goes where it goes, and but yeah, so there's that. There's the sense of there's the sense of the dramatist bringing that kind of criteria into making final judgments, both about the shaping of a poem and the voicing of it. There is that, and there is also, I think, the fact that I kind of came to my understanding of what an artist is, and the relationship between artist and audience in 1970s Jamaica, when I was a young man, and when Jamaica and the whole Caribbean was going through that whole bouleversement of rethinking itself from the ground up, and all that social experimentation and that whole burst of reggae and thing. So my sense of relationship of an artist to the society is very much that it has to be a conversation. It can't be straight simplistic, and but it has to be a conversation always. So that's always at the back of my mind, consciously and unconsciously. And the drama thing feeds it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
wonderful, thank you. And can I open up the floor to everyone in the audience, poets, and also to Ron and to Malaika to continue the conversation, to take the conversation where you want to go.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Let's do that, but also let me acknowledge there are certain people who dedicatedly come back every time. There's Jenny Lewis, there's Jane King, there's Kate, Tony is back, there's Mervyn Taylor, regulars, John Lee is here, Barbara Jenkins. It's so fantastic to just see everybody. And let us welcome two newcomers, but very, very huge poets. There's Kwame Dawes, my dear friend, is in the house. Kwame, are you there? You want to unmute yourself? There's Khadija Abraham, who I'm seeing after a long, long time, I think, as well.
Hi, Khadija.
Hey, Khadija, good to see you. My goodness.
Thank you. It's been wonderful listening to all this amazing poetry, how moving and how inspirational, just each and every poet. I just really enjoyed it. What a wonderful way to spend Saturday afternoon into the evening. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have you. Your turn will come. now that you've shown,
Thank you.
because you're just editing anthologies and doing great things.
I know.
You have to spare some time and read poetry to all of us.
I shall, definitely. Thank
We will
you.
be in touch with you. Also, let me promote my dear friend Indran's magazine. He edits the Beltway Quarterly. And please submit your work there. There's of course Kwame, who is not speaking because he's a terribly, a very refined gentleman. So he's not going to speak now. But he edits this enormously fantastic magazine called Prairie Schooner. So you must send work there as well. There's Punch magazine, which I do, which many of you have already been published in. But yes, I'd like Ron, Malaika, Tony to jump in as well if you want. John, you raised your hand. Do you have something to say, John?
Go ahead, John.
I was just greeting people, but I'm listening in today.
Oh,
It is good to be with all of you again. Great program. What I find as a writer, I listen to other writers that's happened today, and I'm learning so much because I'm thinking, okay, how can I develop my own writing in terms of, I cannot speak of sound, substance, content, speaking to which kind of words. I put something in the chat about who the writer's writing for. And so I've learned so much just listening to that. I had never heard Malaika's poems before. Of course, Ron Price is new to me, and Tony's prose, and of course, Kendall, I know. So for me, it was a learning experience in the most positive sense. So thanks for this, Sudip and Indran, for this opportunity.
John, you're
Thank
so
you.
modest, always. You know, that's one of the things I have to say. This program always brings out. We go back feeling there's a sense of humanity and a sense of collegiality. We have had some of the top poets of the world reading, but the way, whenever they appear on our platform, it's a sense of as if we've known each other for ages, and sometimes we're meeting for the first time. Remember when Lorna Goodison just popped up for the party? Amazing. I mean, it's very difficult to book her, you know. You have to spend a lot of money booking her. She just generously came, and then she said, okay, maybe I'll read.
Oh, Sudeep, I wish you hadn't mentioned money, because everyone, of course, is doing this without
doing this
for free. And thank you for that.
Yes,
Thank you.
So thank you so much, all of you. It's really a treat. As I said, every time it gets better and better and better. If someone else has something to say, please feel free.
I just want to jump in. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
Yes.
Tony.
No, just how wonderful it is to also feel this connection across the continents, that it's a reminder of our, I'm always trying to tell students that your literary peers are not just the people around you, but it's the whole world. And it's lovely that we're able to, that Sudeep and Don and Indran, that you're bringing together people from really all over the world again, and we just share our love of words, thinking what Kendall said about how language begins with sound, and just that it's not about the publishing and about the the teaching or the whatever other aspects. It's about sharing our emotions and our rhythms and our sounds with each other. So thank you.
Yes, and Tony, one of the things Indra and I, when we initially were thinking of doing it, and that's the way it's sort of always worked, we just said it has to be top quality. Friends or no friends, that is irrelevant, because that's the other thing, which is very, very important. Yesterday, I was hearing the Amherst broadcast. You know, it's Joseph Brodsky's birthday year was his celebration last year, but because of the pandemic, they had to postpone it this year. And FSG has brought out, reissued many of his classics and so on. So all the big translators and so on were sort of talking about Brodsky. And the whole idea was, it's so important that the word itself is sacred. Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. And one of the wonderful things about these forums is the way the conversation evolves. Because otherwise you have poets who come and read, plug their book, and then off they go, you know. People stay on. It's 10:30 at night, and I know right now there are at least 3,000 Indians who are watching you guys. It's amazing. They should be sleeping. But that's the power of words. Thank you, guys. Thank you. It was wonderful,
you.
wonderful to have you.
I would just like to add a comment here. I have attended this for the first time, but I must say it has been amazing. It has been a wonderful experience. And listening to all the poets, it has been a great learning experience to me as a poet myself. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I think I was, if I may say something, I think I was marinating. I think Tony completely upset me by stopping abruptly at Unraveling. I haven't met, I met you here, Tony, but I was quite cross with your abrupt ending of Unraveling. I have to say, just to tell you again, you know, just how it hurt my heart. And I was so mesmerized by Ron's poetry. My God, I am just so like gonna look for your work. I love what you're doing with the lines, the musicality, but also the layout of the poems and just the space, the space of it. But every time your last couplet or your last line came in, I would just be like, I didn't know you were going there, but it's so right, the landing. And as usual with Kendall, it's how he reads, you know. It's kind of like, and you can see, I think the poet kind of just takes over Kendall. Like Kendall will be like, and so this poem is about, and then he'll become the poet and just sit back with the actor and then just go into the poem. And I'm just always kind of blown away by the spaces and how the courage, I think, or maybe it's the actor to create such space in the poem, not for drama, but just to give each word its weight. And that's something I learned today. I'm always kind of trying to get to the end of communicate the poem, but I think a lot of us poets are scared of silence in the life space. So just want to acknowledge my fellow writers today and just say how blessed I feel to be sharing work with all of you and to feel as if the work, all of it, was in conversation with each other, even though we didn't know what we were reading.
Thank you, Malaika. That's really generous. I have to add, in terms of looking at the poems on the chat box, it doesn't do justice because, you know, it is only that the width is limited. So often a line, if the line is longer, it just throws the line onto the next line. So unfortunately, you can't always see the real structure of the poem. And there's no way of putting a PDF there because that's how you would normally see it. But the idea is, of course, that, you know, you revisit the poetry, revisit the poet, look at their past work, and then buy every book they publish ever in the future. Isn't that a good thing?
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Very, very much. We will see you again next month, the second Tuesday of next month. And I also run another program very similar to this, which happens on the second Tuesday of every month. And so this coming Tuesday, we have the Conclave event.
Yeah, he runs it with Fiona Sampson, and it's a wonderful conversation again about poetics and prose. I mean, and craft and so really recommend it highly to you if you have time or you can always see it afterwards if you aren't able to catch it live, because it will also be broadcast on the YouTube channels that Sudeep runs and Don runs.
At same time, but second Tuesdays of every month. So check that out.
And if I may just say one more thing, please, if you have time, take a look at the Poetry channel. I would love to have your work up there. Just send it to me by email, reciting a poem, and I will post it with a biography. I'm trying to spread the word as broad as we can through the internet on that in that space. And also, of course, the Beltway Poetry Journal, if you have time. When you have time, send poems. I and my other editor, Sarah Cahill Barron, will look and get back to you. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.
Before we end, we must acknowledge the best poet in the house, Don, who's so humble because he's actually anchoring these things. But this guy, is a brilliant poet himself. Don,
Yeah.
we need to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Don, as well.
Thank you, Don, very much. Without Don, we wouldn't be having this series, basically. So we are always indebted to him for his.
Not only does he anchor our series, he anchors several series, and he's got this open invitation. If ever you need Zoom space or Zoom time, I can always lend it to you. He's one of the most generous people. I've not met in person, but he's a very dear friend now, of course. Thank you. Good night from Delhi. Au revoir. Namaste.
Good day. Good day
peace.
From Washington.
Thank
Good
you.
night from
All my
Delhi.
poet
you.
friends.
Good night
thank
from
you
India.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your voice and your heart. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye from
Thank
Leeds.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Lots
Lee.
of love to all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Be well all. Namaste.